We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.
Welcome, everybody. To all those who've maybe not participated in any of the Claim the Future discussion groups so far, let me just briefly take you through what we've been doing. Around about 9 months ago, we brought together a large group really, of people who are researching on different policy areas, experts, policy researchers, think tanks, and campaigners, to talk about the nature of the society that we were confronting. It was at the very early stages of the COVID pandemic, and we wanted to look at some of the issues that people were having to deal with immediately as a result of the pandemic, but also as a result of 10 years of austerity. The situation that we faced after the general election in 2019, after 10 years of austerity, then being hit by the pandemic, but also not just the immediate issues. Obviously, what we were concerned about, we were in a crisis with the pandemic, but then we were having to confront the existential crisis of climate change. So we brought together, and many of you who participated today were involved in this, we brought together different panels of people on different topics. And it ranged from the economy into the details of social security, debt, housing, public services, employment rights, the need to tackle unemployment and joblessness that was growing. Also issues around the international situation and what was happening with regard to migrants in particular, who have been having a particularly tough time. And we put together a series of papers that we published on the website, the Claim the Future website. If you're interested, have a look at the individual papers. We also brought that together. I summarized most of the papers in a pamphlet that we published at the end of the exercise, the first stage. And it was, I suppose it was, looking back at the last period and some of the policy work that many of us had been involved in developing the Labour Party's 2017, then 2019 manifesto, but then looking at the new situation that we faced with COVID and where we went from here. And it was, the new situation was the 10 years of austerity, yes, of course, how that hit us, COVID pandemic, and the tragedies that was evoking, but also what was happening internationally and globally, and then, as I say, how we confront the climate change threat. So all of that we brought together, and actually it was an enjoyable discussion, listening to people and their ideas. But the most important thing for us was linking the people who were developing research and policy ideas with those who were campaigning, and how both the campaigns and the policy researchers almost nourish the development of the ideas, praxis, if you like, theory and practice put together. And I found it incredibly stimulating. If you read the papers, I think they lay down the foundations of a policy debate for the sort of society that we want to create as we come through the pandemic and as we look to the future. There were a lot of people arguing around or campaigning around the concept of build back better. We thought, actually, we don't want to go back. We want to be better, of course we do, but we want to look at what the future could be, and with quite dramatic change. Since we published the papers and the overall pamphlet, it's all available on the website. Have a look if you can. We've also then, where people want to continue on looking at some issues in depth, that's what we've done. So we've had panel discussions like these today, just to stimulate interest and debate. And we did one on debt with John Montgomery and others who are looking at the debt crisis that was facing individuals and families, and have been promoting now legislation around the issue of the debt write-off. In the same way they wrote off the debts for the banks, why not for others as well that have been hit by the COVID crisis. We've been looking also at constitutional change, radicalising the British state. And we've had one panel, there are a number of panels coming up. We've been working with Pauline Bryan, She's in the House of Lords. She's been developing this whole concept of radical federalism, which I think has actually caught the wind now. And that whole red paper group up in Scotland we've been working with on the economic challenges, particularly around unemployment and the joblessness. We did a session with Gordon Brown around his proposals around campaigning for full employment again. And we've been looking at the ideas around job guarantees, obviously working with trade unions, Institute of Employment Rights and others about how we go forward on that. And since then also we've had sessions on housing and renters and working with Acorn and the Renters Union to tackle this issue of rental debt in particular, control of rents, preventing evictions. But also what's interesting come up in that discussion was Andrew Fisher reminded us that when Keir Hardie originally stood as a Labour MP, he stood for socialism and the abolition of landlordism. So actually the concept of abolishing landlordism came out of those discussions around where we go from here. We've also did a session on land and discussed with George Monbiot and Heather Wetzel from the Land Value Tax Campaign about how we go forward about democratic control of land and also the fair taxation of land to enable us up to a funding base for local government in the future. So all of those ideas have been brewing up. Today, we want to have a discussion about public ownership. Public ownership was a core element of the debate in 2017, 2019 in the general elections and in the Labour manifestos. And we held a conference, we published a report about different forms of ownership and about 21st century public ownership and what it meant. And it was about democratizing the economic life of individuals, of workers themselves, making sure workers had control at work and freedom to unleash their talents as well. But it also was about securing proper wages and conditions of employment where public ownership took place or cooperative ownership took place. It was also about union rights, ensuring that the people were properly valued rather than social value, rather than market value. And also it was about not just the efficient management of those individual sectors of the economy, but actually the efficient management of the economy overall that was contributing to the long-term goals of tackling inequality, but also climate change. So I think we've all come to public ownership from different aspects of our own lives and experiences. I come to it from local government. And if you look back at the forms of public ownership in this country in particular, a lot of it did develop from local government, municipalisation in the first instance, and then later individual struggles that took place, like the popular councillors who were trying to ensure that they could provide local public services at the same time, pay decent wages and have decent quality of provision as well. And what's come out of that, I think, is a recognition in recent years about the new role of public ownership, the sort of way in which public ownership can transform people's lives and at the same time transform our economy in a way that we can tackle the real issues facing our community, both in terms of, yes, the issues around inequality, and in some instances that means low wages and poverty, but also the longer term issues about how we manage our economy to tackle climate change, this existential threat. So what we want to do in this discussion is address some of those issues about what is 21st century public ownership? What does it look like? How will public ownership build back the capacity needed that we have to deal with the pandemic, of course, but also to create the sort of society that we want, is greater levels of equality and the sort of society that we need to mobilize the resources to tackle issues like climate change. And also, actually, it's worth reflecting too in the discussion that we have is how the pandemic has revealed about public services that actually they are, in many instances, too important to be left to the market. Services like mail, water, broadband as well, which became a contentious issue during the general election, but now has been incredibly topical as people are working and educating from home. And the other issue as well, the other question is, if that is the case, if we do accept there's a need for an expanded role of public ownership, what campaigns do we need to launch now to ensure that we extend public ownership, we win the argument around public ownership, and it becomes one of those unstoppable policy demands, if you like, in the coming period. Because there is an anxiety, we have to be honest, there is a bit of an anxiety that public ownership, yeah, it's on the agenda, we put it on the agenda, but to be honest, there are real concerns that may not be pursued now with a different Labour leadership with the same sort of vigour or commitment that it was before. And I don't think that's the view amongst the Labour Party and trade union rank and file or wider society. I think there's a recognition that public ownership does have an important role. So part of our campaign is how do we make sure that that commitment and that interest continues on. So that's what the panel discussions are about today. And we've brought together, what we've done in all of these sessions is bring together a number of people who've been working in the field, both developing ideas, but also campaigning to have those ideas made real, not just in government, but actually at the local community level as well. So I'll go through our first speakers. Our first speaker is Max Harris. I'll read the blurb. I love these blurbs because Max is a good colleague and friend of mine who's worked with me in recent years. He was in our Shadow Treasury team, and he was instrumental in the development of most of the radical policies that we put forward, including specialising in public ownership, insourcing, and universal broadband. Max, you can be described as the first broadband communist by the BBC, if necessary, as they branded it. It became incredibly and has become incredibly popular policy. Since then, Max has worked with us as a key advisor on Claim the Future, and he's just finished his PhD. So at future sessions, I'll be calling him Dr. Max Harris. Max, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. I hope I can be heard okay. And it's great to be on a panel with, I think, some key people, not just from people who formulated ideas for public ownership, but people who are really part of the movement in building a base of support for public ownership. I think the pandemic has really exposed how disfigured the British state is. It's exposed structural racism, it's exposed fragmentation and privatization. And what it's reinforced, I think, is that privatization and outsourcing that began under Thatcher have had long-term structural consequences for how we all live now. It's also revealed something, I think, about what was said in the Blair years as part of the kind of what some people call the ideology of the third way. So what was often said in those years was that the choice between public and private delivery is just a choice about what works, about what delivers a service best. And we still hear that view expressed now, sometimes from people that say, we shouldn't be ideological about this, we should just look at what works. But I think what we've seen in recent months is that actually privatization and outsourcing have done long-term damage to the state. And they've given a long-term boost to outsourcers and private providers when services have been privatized. And that damage has now produced human loss on an enormous scale. And all of that sounds quite negative, but what I want to try to do in this brief talk is say something a bit more positive. I only want to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes and hand over to people who are more expert on this than me. But what I want to do, I suppose, is provide some tools to activists and campaigners fighting against privatization and public ownership. So what I thought I'd do is just set out 3 ways of thinking about and arguing for public ownership in the current moment. Ways of arguing that hopefully connect to people's experiences and to the conditions we all find ourselves in. And for each of these arguments, I wanted to point to a specific example of a public ownership demand that we could all make. So just to flag now, what I want to talk about is first of all, public ownership as repair, as repairing our public realm. Secondly, public ownership as a mission that we can all galvanize behind. And third, about public ownership as a way to enable solidarity. And the 3 examples I wanted to draw on are a Ministry of Public Works, which I can explain a bit more in a moment, public broadband, to come back to that, already flagged by John, and insourcing free school meals, something that's come up especially in the last few weeks. So if I could just begin with that first way of thinking about public ownership and the first way of arguing for it. As I said before, I think what the COVID pandemic has made clear are the crevices and the cavities in the British state. And that comes out of years of the state being run down and being deliberately damaged. And there's a SOAS economist, Alfredo Sadfilo, who wrote about this back in May last year, actually, in quite a perceptive journal article. And I'm just going to quote him where he said, I think ahead of what became clear in recent months, he said, the wealthiest and most uncompromising neoliberal economies, the USA and the UK, were, quote, exposed as being unable to produce enough face masks and personal protective equipment for their health staff, not to speak of ventilators to keep their hospitalized population alive. And he went on to say that these failures were, quote again, caused not only by the lack of productive capacity, but also by deliberate policies from universities to labs to manufacturing. Neoliberalism actively promoted the fragmentation of a range of systems of provision as individual firms scrambled for short-term profit. So put in another way, I guess what he's getting at here is how neoliberalism has hollowed out skills and broken up services, shortened time horizons, all of which has meant that we have this disastrous pandemic response where there hasn't been the productive capacity to produce face masks very quickly, to produce personal protective equipment, to produce ventilators. And I think over time, hopefully we will have a full inquiry which will be able to trace these problems more precisely, and also to kind of apportion weight to the different factors that have caused the disastrous response, the over 115,000 deaths linked to COVID in this country. It will be able to say how much of this is to do with structural racism, how much of this is to do with the systemic neglect of elderly people and elderly people's care, how much of this is to do with fragmentation and privatization. But what I think is clear already is that the hollowing out of the British state has led to a hollowed out pandemic response. And what I think that points to more positively is that there's a real project of repair that is needed to build back the skills and the capacity that has been lost over 40 years in the public sector and in public services. Another economist, Mihail Razorski, recently has been speaking about the need for reconstruction. And I think that need is very real alongside repair. So I think this is one way of arguing for public ownership, is as a way to reinstall the key organs of the public realm that have been ripped out over the last 40 years, first under Thatcher and then under successive governments. And one concrete idea, just to be a bit less high level, that we've mentioned in a Claim the Future paper, which you can find online, as John's mentioned, is a 21st century green Ministry of Public Works. So many of you remember that the UK, of course, has had a Ministry of Public Works before, and it's gone under different names, also set up during a moment of crisis during World War II, and eventually abolished in 1996. Just because it was set up before doesn't mean we have to be nostalgic about this. I think the past Ministry of Public Works was by no means perfect, but I think it shows that something like this existed before and could be remade, in particular in a less top-down, more environmentally friendly way. And so what would a Ministry of Public Works be? Well, basically it would be a ministry, a hub for public infrastructure. So I think one of the concerns about the pandemic response so far is really it's been driven by consultants and corporations. The government has fallen back on consultants and corporations. And my fear is, as we go into a long recovery, is that recovery, and as it becomes more possible to build infrastructure as part of that recovery, that will also be underpinned by consultants and corporations. And the Ministry of Public Works would be a way to say, actually, it's public infrastructure that we need. If the state is funding infrastructure, it makes sense that it owns the results of that funding, that we all own it, and that we create green unionized jobs as part of that project. What a Ministry of Public Works could do is be part of a pipeline where there is coherence across training for skills, construction, and manufacturing. And there's a range of projects that a Ministry of Public Works could undertake. But that's one way we could start to build back the capacity that has been ripped out, as I said. So that's the first way of thinking, perhaps, is public ownership as repair. It's almost a kind of defensive way of arguing for public ownership. But secondly, I think even more positively, we could talk about and argue for public ownership as a basis for missions in the economy. So Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, has written a lot about these missions. This idea is that we need ambitious galvanizing commitments for a government and public to get behind. And again, if we look ahead to the recovery that hopefully we'll come into, a recovery that will potentially not be over in the short term, I think having clear missions with a public basis is going to be very important. And this connects to a point that's a slightly more sort of policy specific point, but I think it's an important one, which is that at the moment we see the Tories beginning to put flesh on the bones of industrial strategy. So this idea of supporting particular industries, but it's a particularly conservative right-wing approach to industrial strategy after Brexit. It's an industrial strategy that involves funneling money off into cronies. It's an industrial strategy that doesn't involve participation by the whole public. And I think that it's very important for the left to develop a unique progressive vision of what industrial strategy looks like, which is more participatory, which involves the whole country, and crucially, which is underpinned by public ownership. And missions are an extension and could be an extension of a left-wing industrial strategy. And to move again to a concrete idea, I think one mission that we could continue to fight for is what John mentioned earlier, the delivery of a public full fibre broadband network. As many of you know, this is part of the 2019 Labour manifesto. It was a policy that John championed and that was jointly developed with the CWU. And I wanted to pay tribute to Dave Ward, also on this call, for being up for the idea and also for helping us to develop the policy and the detail around it. Many of you remember it was a policy framed as a way to connect Britain, as a way to tackle regional inequality, as a way to reduce bills, and as a way to boost productivity. And the idea was to set up a new entity, British Broadband, that would involve bringing the broadband relevant parts of BT, not just Openreach, but also parts of BT Technology, BT Consumer, and BT Enterprise into public ownership in order to provide the base infrastructure to roll out a full fibre network, where full fibre is the kind of gold broadband standard. And the plan was to build the infrastructure over 10 years, to begin with those areas that have the worst connections at the moment, and to move out in 3 tranches. And what we also set out was that because of, and John in particular set out, was that because of low operating costs, it would be possible to provide broadband for free through paying for it via a tax on multinationals. Some have said that this policy has been vindicated recently, as John alluded to. Owen Jones recently wrote a good piece in The Guardian calling on Labour to re-upload it as a policy. And I think it's true that the economic logic still applies. The government's still able to borrow more cheaply than the private sector. There's still a case for removing shareholder dividends to reinvest in the network. There's still economies of scale. There's still coordination value in having a public broadband network. And we still see market failures in that there's only 14% now of, as of last year, of the country covered by full fibre. Also, we've seen the social benefits alongside that economic logic become crystal clear. The need for people to be supported to do their homework, the need for people to connect, and so on and so forth. But what I think is really important is that those who supported the policy don't just pat ourselves on the back or claim that we've been vindicated, but we also emphasize the policy is still possible and still needed. As I said, 85% of the country is still not covered by full fibre broadband, while South Korea and Japan have almost 100% coverage. And as well as that, the idea of a multinational tax still has a strong case for it, especially as we've seen big tech do very well out of this pandemic. And there was a plan developed as part of the 2019 manifesto, actually quite a simple approach to multinational tax called unitary taxation, which sounds quite technical, but basically says that the proportion of activity that a multinational company has in the UK should be the basis for the proportion of a company's global profits that are taxed. So if Amazon, say, has 5% of its workforce and operations and sales, those are the 3 elements that were the relevant activity. If it has 5% of that in the UK, then the idea is they're taxed at 5% of their global profits at the usual corporation tax rate. It's a way of approaching multinational tax that has been developed and supported by people like the Tax Justice Network, and it could still be achieved now and joined up to paying for parts of public broadband. There's lots of risks in the mission language. In particular, I think there is a risk that we fall into a kind of colonial mindset. We've seen in recent months the government fall into this and talking about a world-beating COVID response. So I think it's really important that any mission is connected to a kind of internationalist project. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Satoko Kishimoto from TNI, who's on this call, who's done a lot of great work on making linkages around public ownership internationally and ensuring there are partnerships across the board. I'm running out of time, so just very briefly, the last way of thinking I was going to mention was public ownership as an enabler of community solidarity. Often, when we talk about public ownership, it can be counterposed against the community, the state versus community, top-down versus bottom-up. And I think that's actually not the right way of drawing this contrast. And the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell developed really exciting thinking around alternative models of ownership, which would ensure that public ownership is participatory and can mobilize the community. And a concrete example of this is an issue that's been in the news recently, which is free school meals, where I think there can be an argument for insourcing free school meals so that local government and central government provide infrastructure and the service for free school meals. Some people say there's a lack of infrastructure at the moment. I think as part of the recovery, we could be talking about community kitchens, which bring together the different diverse community groups who've already been working on free school meals, such as fans supporting food banks, such as some of the Sikh-led community food banks and other community initiatives. And what this is an example of is the way public ownership can galvanize that kind of community spirit. And so it's not public ownership versus the community, it's public ownership building community. The free school meals is also an example of a universal public service, and that's an idea that's gaining traction, the idea of free public services. Mary Robertson and Rory McQueen did a lot of work on that. John championed that. And there's some great written work online, which you can find out about that. It's an idea I think we should take forward. So those three ideas, just to summarize: public ownership as repair, public ownership as mission, public ownership as enabling solidarity. The very last thing I wanted to say before shutting up is I was thinking just at the end about the NHS as a real great cultural treasure in this country, and how we sometimes forget that not just that it was an example of public ownership, but also that it involved a scrap. And if you go back and look at the history of the NHS, there was great opposition by the medical profession, and it's an example where consensus was built over time, and consensus was a consequence, not a prerequisite of good policy. And what it shows is we have to fight for public ownership against vested interests amongst comrades, and hopefully some of these arguments that I've set out can help us all in that fight.
That was superb, Max. You covered a hell of a lot of ground in 15 minutes. That was terrific. Thanks for that. That was really good. Lizzie Fletcher in the chat has said, is he Australian? No, he's a New Zealander. And he's about to go back to New Zealand. But the good thing about the networks now is that we'll maintain contact. In fact, we're most probably going to tag him in some form to make sure he stays within the discussions and contributed to the work that we're doing. Max mentioned the work of Satoko Kishimoto, who's our next speaker. Let me just read you through Satoko's background. She's an environmental activist and active in the youth environmental movement in Japan in the 1990s. She began working with the Transnational Institute in 2003, and she started the Water Justice Project in the TNI to seek alternatives to water privatization. Satoko is now the program coordinator for public alternatives at the TNI. And exactly as Max said, what we wanted to do in this discussion is to demonstrate that we've got to no longer have these insular discussions. We've got to really broaden them, and recognizing that actually this is a global debate that's taking place now. And the more that we can learn from others, the easier the path will be as we go through this next period in terms of discussions of public ownership. Satoko, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John, for inviting me here this discussion. Even though I'm not from the United Kingdom, I'm really thrilled to be here. I also thrilled today, this morning, to read your position paper on public ownership in the time of a pandemic, especially focusing on healthcare. So this same morning, I just got the news from the other side of the world. By the way, this 15 minutes, the contribution I try to make, as John said now, the relevance and dimension of European and international discussions and mobilization on democratic public ownership. I'm from Transnational Institute, which is international policy research NGO based in Amsterdam. Well, I think in the Saturday afternoon, many people are only listening this the talk by ears. But in case you have seen the video, maybe I want to ask to share the screen to have a little image. Well, this morning I got the news from Canada. So the trade union, public employee trade union CUPE has initiated a new campaign call for the profit long-term care facilities to be brought back to public control. So this is the petition started the national wide in Canada. What is the background is the same as the other European countries. The 4 out of 5 COVID-19 related deaths in Canada has either been residents or staff of long-term care home. So this is also the result of decades of underfunding and understaffing. This is really, really common in UK and other European countries. It's also the lesson and the realization the public healthcare system is really diverse, but that from medical care, testing, and tracing, but also other cares from baby to elderly care, long-term cares, as well as cleaning, portaling, and catering. Those really, really diverse services. Services are part of the healthcare system. We have to look at as an integrated system. So that sense, your position paper, describing the future position paper, is very. We can learn a lot this integrated public health approach. The next image slide, please. Excuse me. Well, this is another interesting development. This is about the European level. Just the new report by Corporate Europe Observatory came out last week. So this is the matter of the European policies, different, diverse, a lot of tools and policies. How last decades those policies systematically and structurally has weakened the public health system in member countries. This study also backs the other study by UNDP. It says 10% increase in public health expenditure relates to 4.3 increase in COVID-19 cases and 4.9 increase of COVID-19 related mortality. So this report goes into which policies in the European Union come to the member states, including public-private partnerships and the public spending cut. They all structurally contributed to increase of outsourcing, fragmentation, and weakened public health capacity. Now, the European Union just launched a new initiative of EU Recovery Fund, which is part of the Recovery Fund, in which it has the EU for Health, which is 94 billion euros investing in the public the healthcare. As Max said, this is a public money, our money. The result of this such a program has to belong to people. At this same moment, the really growing corporations, I mean the private service providers of many care services, what we are talking about, they are lobbying very actively to be able to access this kind of public funding to present themselves as the actors to bring solutions in this public health crisis. So we are having the same situation in this crisis. The private health service providers are taking this as an advantage to expand their own market and their contract. So that's we cannot allow to happen anymore. So this is that's why so important as movement, as trade unions, we have to be very clear to demand our state and also EU, I mean our case in the European Union, to be very clear about the recovery, the package, and especially come to healthcare. EU has to fundamentally change their different pieces of legislation and service directives into to supporting and strengthen the public healthcare in integrated way. So that's something we have to be united to advocate towards the policymakers. Okay, so then and also I want to say that the research work in the European level, on the Private Healthcare Act at multinational transnationals is the many groups are start engaging. This is also very interesting to see the many NGOs and research groups. They really think this healthcare crisis as a big opportunity of big change to other areas to shift the balance, the power of balance. So, okay, so that's well, I want to move a little bit about my how to say my work. I'm active in the last 10 years, remunicipalization, deprivatization, and reclaiming public services movement. John a little bit told before. So try to. I think this is really the time to join forces with the public health movement and other sectors, the groups working on such the defending public services. This is already happening as we see the Canadian unions and also the corporate observatory group networks start engaging more in the public health issue. So that's the part of the effort, global effort. We have developed the global deprivatization database with University of Glasgow. By today, that's publicly accessible. I put that later the link. At this moment, we have 1,448 cases. So for instance, this database navigates you, for instance, you can search like UK, so that you get cases. If you can search health and social care, you get 159 cases, for instance. So there are many cases like elderly care and nursery care from Nordic countries, and also quite some cases in hospitals, 21 cases of hospitals, especially from Australia. Well, these individual cases are important to take a lesson to learn, but I want to say that not individual cases are important, but the bigger level, national level of the policy changes to integrate it, national wide policies on public ownership is necessary especially when it comes to the public health and the climate crisis, which we are facing too. So this, as Max really nicely addressed, this the effort of local changes and the national level policy changes go together, work together, and strengthen each other. And especially national level policy will enable or facilitate the community and the local level changes in the scale by coordination. So that's I see the link between your work and also the deprivatization movement, which I presented. So last 4 minutes, I want to use the little bit more positive story. Can you go back to the slide? about how to build democratic public ownership. So this this story comes from France. You may know that last year's local election in France, there are big wave. Yeah, next one. Thank you. There was a really impressive, significant wave of green and red and municipalist alliance won in the local election in June 2020. So as a result, the big cities, including Marseille, Lyon, Bordeaux, Nantes, Strasbourg, they all have now the green and green-red alliance. So that's this is the backdrop of many big small cities. They have won the kind of the progressive alliance, based on the municipalist movement. Well, what is happening today? We have seen the big second wave of big water remunicipalization in France. For instance, most important cases is Lyon and Bordeaux. You might know that in Paris, that was the very symbolic, important remunicipalization of water happened in 2010. So that has been just more than 10 years has passed. So now the other cities like Lyon, which is the birthplace of the private water management in France, just decided in December to stop. Not to renew the contract with the private water company. This begins is 1855. So this is a long history of private management, which will be ending 2023 with the decision of a new city council. Why this is important is. Well, like in France, not only Paris, but also other places like the Grenoble and Nice, they have the experience to rebuild public ownership. There are three important points. So what public ownership can bring in case of water, but maybe also other sectors. One is the potential the participatory governance of the public company. Second is long-term planning and investment. Third is the, excuse me. What is the third again? Sorry, I will come back. So those, the positive, how to say, outcome experienced in the other cities in France has created some public confidence, I think. So this is also the pushing to other big cities like Bordeaux and Lyon to really public confidence to go back to public management of water. So this I can say that this the real experience of democratic public ownership is very important and critical to build not only experience but also confidence to move forward. Okay, and the last yes. So this is just last our one of our work. This together with Spanish, Catalan Energy Sovereignty Network. They made a very important publication. This is called the Municipalist Manifesto, propose to profound change to the current energy model. This is about energy. So this is a 60 pages, really concrete proposals from municipalists towards your own local government and also local government to national government in the area of energy poverty, participation, transport, ecofeminism, the generation, distribution, and retailing and data ownership of energy system. It consists of 16 concrete examples to how to transform energy system, based on the energy democracy. So I'm just sharing this report. I think this is that kind of resource will be hopefully helpful to international context. In Britain and other countries, we, community groups and group organizations can push concretely the agenda and the proposal towards the on city and town, and also the to bring big scale changes. Thank you.
Satoko, thank you so much for that. That was really, that was so intensive. And you've provided us with a lot of information and access to the databases and other reports. I hadn't seen that Catalan report. I'll access that. It looks really absolutely fascinating. Thanks for that. That was really helpful. What I thought was good was the comprehensive positiveness as well about how the changes that are taking place positively, and particularly around the municipalization issue agenda. We'll come back to that in the discussion period. Thanks ever so much, Satoko. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Pascal Robinson. Pascal runs a successful campaign for better buses in Greater Manchester for possibly my favourite group that's been campaigning in recent years, which is called We Own It, which has been campaigning from literally started as a grassroots organisation, is a massive grassroots organisation. It's built itself up into, I think, one of the most, as I said, the leading campaign organisation against privatisation, first of all, but also for 21st century public ownership. Pascal's worked on a range of issues from all the way from food waste to international justice. Really pleased you've joined us, Pascal. Over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here with you all, and it's so brilliant to hear all of this hope and these amazing ideas as well in particular. So just to introduce We Own It really quickly, we're a voice for public service users. We run campaigns for public ownership of public services because we believe that we own services. We should own them rather, because we use them and we pay for them. So we've had several victories, including winning our campaign to stop the privatisation of the body NHS professionals. We won a victory on the East Coast Railway line, and we most recently succeeded in our campaign to get probation brought back into public hands. But obviously we've got a long, long way to getting well-funded, world-class public services that are democratically run for us, for our communities. And I want to speak today about why any people's plan, any recovery plan needs to prioritise bringing those services back into public hands. To be a bit specific, I want to focus on PPE as an example of privatisation and its DNA of misery and failure. I want to talk about how public ownership is really popular and therefore is a great focus for any voice on the left, and what that means for our programme of priorities and what that could look like in the years ahead. So it's clear that privatisation of our public services is an absolute joke. It's a scam that rips off our communities, and that's what We Own It tries to drive home every single day. It's been clear in the last year that the state has to intervene to provide the basic necessities of staying alive, as the market cannot, and more importantly, will not, make sure that people have places to sleep, food to eat, transport, and the list goes on and on. It's also thrown into the limelight, though, the scale of the government's belief in the market, its belief in outsourcing vital services to private companies, and its practice of putting profit above basically everything else. And this has been ruining people's lives for decades, but the crisis has literally shown that it can cost lives. So privatisation, of course, as others have highlighted, left our public services creaking even before the pandemic, and it meant we weren't able to deal with it. And we need to highlight every single day how this suffering is a key part of the DNA. It's not an aberration. It's not a case of bad apples and giving Chartwells a tap on the wrist for not following the guidelines, for example, on free school meals. So this was really clear, I think, when it came to PPE, and our NHS supply chain was actually privatised back in 2006, and this was a mess. Movianto, for example, had a £55 million contract in 2018 to provide a stockpile of equipment, mostly in the case of a pandemic. And what actually happened is that drivers reported that they were barely able to get deliveries out, that it was short-staffed, chaotic, and there had been smoke damage and concerns around asbestos in the warehouse. And We Own It actually wrote a report that highlighted the depth of the mess that procurement is in. There are 11 different towers that procurement is divided into, and there are 4 levels of profit taking before the doctor or the nurse gets any PPE equipment. And what this was supposed to deliver was efficiency savings, but in reality, supplies were rationed and the country was left unprepared. And yet Movianto is often depicted as a bad apple, a shock story. But this is a perfect example of how privatization plays out in reality. It means cost cutting to make profits somewhere. It means fragmentation. We have complicated systems that divide up responsibility in a really long chain, and it leaves big gaps. It means a lack of accountability in services that are the difference between life and death. And it means a lack of investment. And when things go wrong, the public picks up the purse anyway. In this case, the army had to come in and intervene. And of course, outsourcing of test and trace had many of the exact same dynamics. And these are just 2 failures among a list of hundreds that have put lives at risk. And I think it's our role as campaigners every day to highlight the ways these private companies fail and will continue to fail. Having said this, the vast majority of the public already see what a bad idea it is to privatise and outsource. Public ownership is extremely popular with leavers and remainers, with the young and the old, across different regions, social classes and political divides. And even a majority of conservative voters believe in the public ownership of rail and water. And public support for public ownership increased only further during Corbyn's leadership. After 40 years of unthinking ideology, he really challenged that and brought that into the mainstream. And we saw that across various different sectors becoming increasingly popular. And I mean, with regards to bringing them back into public ownership. So this was, of course, in the face of a barrage of right-wing media. And this was simply a well-resourced lie that they told again and again. But what that means for us is that we cannot afford to believe the lies that there isn't enough money after this pandemic for our public services. Despite the pandemic resulting in business closures and job losses, last year was a very good one on the Bloomberg index. They collectively gained $1.3 trillion, and that was in November, that stat. They found the magic money tree to give millions to their mates when they could have invested in NHS labs, for example. They set up a completely parallel network. And they did the same with train companies, and there are so many other examples like that. So we've got to make really bold demands to dramatically shift the economy towards one that works for us. And there's a really big appetite for that change. We don't want to go back to normal. 6% of the public actually want to return to the pre-pandemic recovery. Having water, Royal Mail, and large parts of our energy and broadband system would save us 8 billion per year across those sectors. And if Parliament decided to compensate companies, public ownership would pay for itself within 7 years, and it would reap huge benefits. So if we know that investing in public services and public hands is really popular, it's a question of priorities. So what are these priorities, and how do they help us get to a democratic and caring economy that people really, really want? So firstly, I think we need a new deal for our health services. Labour's biggest legacy at the next election could be protecting the NHS from further privatisation and pushing the government to reverse this, reversing the underfunding and the cuts that we've seen for decades. So right now, we've seen as of yesterday that the plan for integrated care systems has been leaked, and we know that there is a risk that private companies could be on the boards of those integrated care systems, making decisions about commissioned healthcare. We've also seen a constant flow of private contracts, and we haven't even had access to most of those private contracts. Privatisation is being ramped up during this crisis, and it's a perfect example of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. And this is something that We Own It pledges to fight on this year, is to fight for an NHS in public hands. And we know it's popular. Our campaign on Satoko Test and Trace galvanised 25 different groups across the country to go out to their town halls and demand not a penny more to Serco. This was obviously when it was safer to do that. And we saw people very happy to embarrass Matt Hancock and call him out on that horrendous decision to outsource on every single platform they could. So I think we on the left need to get even better at advocating for an NHS run in public hands. For example, ridding the NHS of vile, hostile environment policies, their attack on all of us, and the very principle of universal healthcare. Beyond that, we cannot believe that there isn't enough money to fund the NHS to help our country to recover. Spending billions on the private sector is short-sighted and it's self-defeating. It will only further reduce the resilience of our NHS and diminish our ability to respond to public health crises in future. And as others have highlighted on this call, rebuilding our state capacity is such a big priority in these next years. As we've seen over the last few months, it's well-funded public services in public hands and the people that work for them every single day that actually offer us hope and a way out of this crisis that the government has actually created. Furthermore, we need a national care service available to all who need it. And Scotland is said to be considering this, and that would be a really important way of ensuring that the mistreatment that we've seen doesn't happen again, I think. Secondly, I think we need to push for a Green Deal as part of a wider fight to increase our state capacity. The crisis of the global climate emergency is already harming millions of people, especially in the global south. And we have a duty to bring services back into public ownership as a way to tackle that, and also to create hundreds of thousands of jobs in generating energy and new industry supply chains. Wind and solar power can be delivered almost everywhere in the UK, and it would reverse decades of underinvestment. That would be really levelling up, and groups like Green New Deal are organising for this right now. We also need public control and ownership of our bus networks, so that they work for the community rather than bus companies who make a tidy profit off it. There are campaigns cropping up all across the country, for example, Better Buses for West Yorkshire, which is doing amazing work to push around the mayoral elections. And I'd love to see more campaigns. I'm really up for chatting to anyone that wants to campaign on buses. And this is important to the levelling up agenda that the government supposedly want to push. We've given millions to these bus companies and we've not demanded at all for equity stakes in them. But this would be a really crucial way to get control over our transport services, which is really vital to this. And equally, the same goes for the railway, which is a natural monopoly that we should be able to control to actually have any chance for decent service. So I want to wrap up right now, but just end with a note that the government seems to keep wanting to keep the private companies in the wings, ready to profit off us once this crisis is over. However, there's no doubt the political space has opened up. The left should be telling the story of COVID-19 and creating a new narrative from the wreckage, one that does justice to our public services and the amazing people that work in them every day. We need to demand a lot and articulate our vision, because it's only with public services in public hands that we'll be able to meet the challenges of the future and have a chance of everyone having a decent quality of life. And I'm really looking forward to working with everyone on this call to achieving that vision. And I'll stop there.
Wow, thanks, Pascal. You and Kat Hobbs from We Own It, you always inspire me. It's just incredible, the work that you've done. Thanks for both the work on the ground, but also the development of the policies and the cutting through. I think you're right to call them lies within the media. I think they are. And we've seen another exercise today about Boris Johnson's supposed reforms in the NHS, which looks like an easy attempt to privatise, not this ending of privatisation as it's been reported in some. Thanks ever so much for that. That was just terrific. Our next speaker is Dave Ward. Dave's the General Secretary. He was elected back in 2015 of the General Secretary of the CWU, the Communications Workers Union. CWU now has got, obviously it represents workers in the postal and telecommunications sector and the industry itself, over 180,000 members. Dave's another person that inspires me, as Max has said, in terms of the development of policies around broadband, but also about the post bank and the way in which public service can operate broadly in terms of the support of the community, going well beyond, in some instances, well beyond the call of duty, as many of his members do on a daily basis, but never seem to get either credited for it or acknowledged for it. And Dave, thanks for coming and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, John. And it's really a pleasure to be on the Claim the Future project. What interests me about the project as a trade union leader is the point that John made right at the start, that this is about combining new solutions, new thinking, but with a call for action on the ground to deliver it. And I think that message says to me that you don't wait for political change. Whatever the debates that are going on within the Labour Party at the moment, I'm going to be honest, my energy is into driving change in this country for our members, for their families, for workers everywhere, and for a fairer, more democratic society. And basing that on universality of services is absolutely crucial to deal with the outcomes of this health crisis, to deal with the economic crisis that we're going to face. I'm actually very confident that I can feel and sense there's a mood out there that can deliver change. And I want to talk a little bit today about some of the areas where I believe we can combine this new thinking with trade union action on the ground, with trade unions that are willing to work with other new models of collectivism that we see in society that are doing a great job in talking about solidarity, in challenging the powerful forces, economic forces and political forces that have really overseen everything that's wrong in society in my lifetime. And, we're committed to that now. And, I'm not going to let any splits in the Labour Party or any talk about Labour stopping us from doing that. And I think we need to focus as a left and have confidence in our solutions. Because I do want to pick up on the point that Max has said. It's a very interesting journey when John was Shadow Chancellor, when Jeremy was leader of the Labour Party, and when they came to us and asked us to sort of consider supporting a call for British broadband and BT. BT had been privatised in 1984. At the time, it was actually part of the GPO, the old post office. The two worked together. And a lot of our members had never, ever worked in a public company. And, we had a really interesting discussion about how that would happen, what it would mean for jobs, what it would mean for standards of employment, how we would tackle, which I found very interesting, the reality that there were many different companies that had grown out of privatisation, out of liberalisation, that were exploiting workers. And our job was not just to look after BT in that sense. It was about building an idea, a universal service, the full rollout of full fibre broadband across the UK to drive a new economy, to end digital exclusion. And, these things were about bringing workers together. So it was an opportunity for us as a trade union to get behind a policy that not only secured the right thing for the country, but also extended to potentially securing workers on decent terms and conditions, the rate for the job, not the race to the bottom, which privatisation and liberalisation has driven. So that was a great policy, and it's really interesting to see how much that is now being talked about as a solution to some of the problems that we've seen with the pandemic. So, we have the ability to get behind those policies now. We can do something about that as a trade union. We can agree shared demands as trade unions to fight for standards across sectors of the economy. So we can work towards public ownership. We can work towards universal services. And our job is to be the part that is the action on the ground. I want to talk to you about Royal Mail, because I think Royal Mail is a really, really interesting case study of what can be achieved. So Royal Mail was privatised in 2013. At the time, there was different political leaders in the Labour Party. There was different political forces, not different. There was other political forces out there that all seemed to be saying the same thing. Royal Mail was a basket case. The only answer to it was to privatise it. This was after years of undermining the service, undermining investment in the service. So it wasn't a great story in public ownership. But what then happened after many years of it being a cash cow, really, for the government, not investing in the service, was that we were facing privatisation. Our union took a decision at that time that we couldn't afford just to have a political battle over that. We had to have an industrial strategy to deal with that. We reached an agreement after a dispute in 2013 where we weren't able to stop privatisation because ultimately that was a political decision. But what we did do was we got assurances through the strength of our union, through the strength of our membership in their workplaces, which meant that we could restrict over a period of years what privatisation could do. So we got an agreement that there would be no outsourcing, there would be no breakup of the company, there would be no new contracts of employment coming in with worse terms and conditions for other workers. There would be no sort of Royal Mail would continue to provide a universal service. So even though it was privatised, it still had that responsibility, and that would be its role. Now, obviously, the service has gone on. There's been some issues around letter decline, but we've just recently got a new agreement. And this agreement, I think, shows the way forward for dealing with companies that have been privatised, but can get back to public ownership and can also continue to provide a really important universal service. So our agreement has challenged and changed completely the strategy that a private company was using. So what Royal Mail wanted to do, why we've been in dispute for almost 2 years now, was that they wanted to bring about a situation where they only went after parcel growth, and any responsibility for delivering a universal service to the country was seen as a hindrance, was seen as the end of the company. And all they wanted to do really was create a separate parcels company over a number of years. And anything that grows, i.e. the parcels, put it in the new company, bring in new terms and conditions, bring in a new workforce, and let Royal Mail and its infrastructure as we know it wither on the vine. The deal that we've just got has actually challenged that strategy, and it's put in place a completely different strategy for the future. Yes, we're going to go after parcel growth, but importantly, we're going to do it in the core business. We're going to do it by utilising the existing workforce. We're going to do it by utilising workers on good terms and conditions, not those who have been exploited in other parts of this particular sector that you're seeing at the moment with growth in some of the jobs that are delivering parcels. But more importantly, we're going to diversify Royal Mail services. We're going to start looking at ways that we can support communities, that we can support local businesses. We can expand the role of a postal worker. And the argument that we've won with Royal Mail is that the future is now going to be based on leveraging the trust that a postal worker has with the customer on the doorstep. And I think this opens up some fantastic opportunities to think about a role for the future of Royal Mail that could really benefit society, that could be as relevant to today and going forward as what letters were in the last 40 or 50 years. So the sort of things that we want to see Royal Mail take on now is, we want to be looking after people, checking on the elderly, checking on the vulnerable, delivering medicines. We want to be working with local communities in building community wealth. Royal Mail could be right at the centre of providing good local services that develop solutions for local people. We want to work with government services. We want to work with councils. We want to help support climate change. And there are many things that a Royal Mail that diversifies but still is underpinned by the principle of its universal service that could deliver for society. So we're excited about the new agreement. It gives us a platform to build a different future for Royal Mail. So, finally, I want to talk about the role of trade unions together in this debate. The CWU has also pushed at the TUC in the last couple of years for a new deal for workers in this country. And working with other trade unions that are starting to organise now, are starting to use meetings like this. The NEU the other week, the National Education Union, had something like 100,000 people online of their members talking about the issues and safety at schools when they forced the government into a U-turn. Now, I think we can organise. I think we can mobilise. I think we've got the policies, but we need, as trade unions, to regain confidence in that we can mobilise workers, use the things that have cut through from the pandemic, biggest one of all that's cut through is the value of key workers today. So this is a time where unions should be challenging companies on their strategy for the future. We should be challenging against outsourcing. We should be arguing for insourcing now. We should be arguing for proper contracts of employment. And we should be making sure that key workers are not only valued in society for the work they do, but they get paid the proper rate for the job. These are important moments for us. And, you know, I'm going to say that as Labour sort of fights to decide whether or not it seems to be obsessed with more what it's not than what it actually is at the moment, this is a moment where the left has to regroup, has to have the confidence, and through trade unions being the action on the ground, fighting for a new deal for workers in this country, and with public ownership underpinning that and universal services underpinning that, we're going to make progress. Of that, I'm certain.
Thanks, Dave. That was really helpful. Actually, it's brought a new angle to the discussion that we need to have now. We've got a few minutes left in which there's a few questions been thrown and comments been thrown at us. Can I apologise to Dan, who does our technical work as well? He keeps reminding me on this to remind viewers to like, share and subscribe, but I get carried away in the discussion, Dan. That's the problem, so I forget. I just want to lead on from Dave's point there and feed it to the other speakers as well. Just as one comment, and aside, George Binnett, a former Unison branch secretary, put in the chat as well, this just to remind people that what privatisation has done during this pandemic, when workers were transferred across under the TUPE legislation, there were supposed to be protections, etc., that didn't last particularly long in some sectors. So, for example, occupational sick pay went or was undermined in some sectors. And the reason he's pointed that out is that without a proper level of occupational sick pay, workers then can't self-isolate, or if they do, they face hardship. And then it's interesting, all these things contribute in their own way. So that when you have a crisis, they contribute in a way which can be seriously deleterious to everyone's health, not just those individuals. And I haven't looked upon the TUPE issue, but I'm looking across a lot of the privatisations that have taken place. Although TUPE was meant to protect over years, it hasn't. That's the tragedy in all of this as well. So, George, thanks for reminding us of that. This issue, I just want to talk to the other speakers as well. David set out, really, I know I'm obsessed with trying to get the Labour Party to maintain its policies and develop them on, but you'd expect that of a Labour MP. That's my job. But actually, Dave's point about that's the, you know, you can obsess about all you want, but actually the way we move things on is not necessarily just within party debates. It's much broader than that, isn't it, really? And it's the point you made, Max, in the economic discussions that we had. It's going back to Hilary Wainwright's work back in the old GLC days of participatory popular policies, popular industrial strategy, participatory work in terms of the development of industrial strategy in that way. In that way, you're laying the ideas so that no matter who's in the leadership, the Labour Party or whatever, those ideas, so dominant in society, people just have to think, well, to get elected, we have to go with the flow. Is that the way? Max, I'll start you off.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I definitely agree, yeah, with the spirit of what you said and what Dave was saying about bringing people together behind the campaigns. I guess on that, and on also another question about changing people's minds, I think one challenge is when these services have been taken out of the public sector, there's also been an effort to take them out of politics and to depoliticize these issues so that we're not talking about alternatives. And to go back to one of Pascal's points, I think we're in a position where, you know, when the bus is late or the fares go up, we think, oh, there's nothing we can do about it because it's off the political agenda. Or we think, you know, it's just a bad apple. And I think the key for us is to repoliticize these issues. And WeOwnIt's been doing a lot of great work on this. Actually, everyone on this call has been engaged with this so that, so that we know that we can join the dots between the fares going up and the buses being late and a for-profit model. And and build campaigns around that. So yeah, and I think political education has a role to play in that. It's been really encouraging to see different groups pushing political education in the last few months. But yeah, I hope that gets at some of the questions, but interested in other people's thoughts as well.
Just on We Own It then, Pascal. We Own It has been one of the most successful campaigns I've seen in recent years in terms of getting the ideas across, but also linking up with other groups. Just give us a few examples of what We Own It have done, like your bus campaign and things like that. How's that mobilized people?
So CAT realised quite quickly that the Bus Services Act in 2017 offered an opportunity to go for public control. The Conservatives have made it illegal to buy bus companies. So they've made public ownership of buses illegal, which is which is shocking. But public control is an opportunity. And so we decided that we wanted to set a precedent in Greater Manchester. And so our campaign there has been about bringing together a really broad coalition, environmental groups, cycling groups, anti-poverty groups, community groups, unions, all together to say we want better buses for our communities as passengers and as staff, and that's exactly what we deserve. London has decent buses. Nottingham, Reading, Edinburgh, where they're in public ownership, have great buses. We deserve the same, and I completely agree with some of those. There's a dynamic of setting higher expectations and constantly linking the bad service, the way it's run now, with privatization, and how public control and public ownership can fix that and make people's lives really better in a concrete way. And that's maybe in an anecdotal way, that's why we focused more in that campaign on better services and what that means in terms of affordability and reliability, more than say the environmental angle. And that's something that we need to think about when we're running other campaigns across the country, is how we combine the two better. But we've also run campaigns for the public ownership of water, and that was an amazing campaign that really popularized that idea and showed how ridiculous it was that these multinational companies were profiting off something that we have no choice to use. Similarly, we've tried to work across various different sectors, and I think the team is amazing at showing how privatization ruins our lives and how public ownership would reap so many different benefits.
I think we've moved on to almost a different scale now, but I'll come back to that. But on the water, what got me I agree with you that what people start talking about public ownership when the privatization is failing them. And people get really angry that it's failing them, they're not getting the service. But actually also people don't like being ripped off. And on water, that 10 years ago, I was doing work on water, and I couldn't believe the scale of money that was going out to shareholders on services that were leaking water on a scale we've not seen since any form of public ownership. And in addition to that, bills were going up every year despite the poor service. I was on Mar. I don't know whether you were briefing me at that time, Max, but I was on Mar, and I raised water, and the Mar program, you used to sit on the sofa at the end with your opposition, so I was on with some Tory minister, I can't remember what it was now. And he was going on about how wonderful privatisation was and water. And I said, yeah, it was. You shelled out £18 billion in shares to these shareholders of poor service. And then I reminded him he was a director of a water company when privatisation. So they all made money out of it. It was scandalous. They stopped me sitting on the sofa in the end. They wouldn't do it anyway. I think they thought I was going to bite them. I don't know. There you are. Satoko, just on the European examples, if you don't mind me asking, because I saw the booklet about something like 800 examples of municipalisation, bringing things back into municipal ownership. How has that happened is that as a result of popular campaigning or popular demand, or how has it actually happened?
Well, I think this is what we are discussing, in a way, making dots, small dot connecting as a network, as a spider web. So there's each sector has each dynamic. It's interesting dynamics in healthcare and water, energy, everything different. But when we kind of connect as a public ownership or democratization of public services, then people start realizing this is something the bigger bigger fight. And also people start realizing the benefit of sharing of lessons and cases. So that's something I mean, Transnational Institute wants to play a role. The very important local fights in UK and any other places are connected and even cross-sector. So that's the what is the lessons. So then especially come to the ownership question. This is very critical, you know, what we are discussing, like this is something we need to create a new one, not something we don't really know such a level of democratic ownership in any countries. So that's why I think this networking and learning each other is very, very important.
Why do people think health was such a target for the Tories? Because of the scale of the resources being invested, or because it was easier to quietly privatise it? Because this morning in one of the reports I saw, because you know, we've seen these references to crony contracts that have been issued, etc. But I thought it was interesting in one of the reports this morning that one calculation of a group of contracts was 800 million. And then they looked at the companies, and those companies that largely got those contracts had contributed 8 million in donations to the Conservative Party. And so you had to, basically, you invest a bit, you know, you get 10 times return for every investment in the Tory Party. And as the commentator was saying, you don't have to call it corruption, because all it is a wise investment for those companies. Invest in the Tory Party, they get elected, and automatically you'll get contracts as a result of that. You don't have to wine and dine ministers too much, although I'm sure that goes on as well. But health seems to be their specific target. And I wonder why. Is it because so much else has been privatized already, or is it just because of the scale of it? What do you think, Pascal?
I would say that they see it as a huge market of potential. They see our data as a great way to stuff their mouths with gold, and the NHS is, of course, one of the last bastions of a solidarity-based health economy, a health service, and of course the implications for deconstructing the NHS is huge across all of the world. But of course we've seen gradually the NHS has already been eroded, and Public Matters actually does some amazing work highlighting how much of a long-term plan this has been to bring us to an American ACO model, and it's incredibly complicated. So it's really easy for them to push this as integration and improvement and population health management, but those things are also being done in a conjunction of shutting hospitals, of underfunding care services, giving private companies a bigger spot on the board. And you're completely right that they see this as a really big opportunity. I mean, Lord Ashcroft, when we were looking at him getting the vaccine contract, he has on his website this page which says, if you're an entrepreneur, reach out to me and we can chat business. And you think, this is mad. You see our health services as another fun idea that you can experiment with. And Serco's CEO himself in that leaked email said, if we can make this work, this is a great way to position ourselves as being further in the NHS supply chain. And Satoko can speak to the intense lobbying that they do all day, every day.
Is that right, Satoko?
Oh, totally. I think this is I mean, as Pascal said, this is the huge, potential of public money available, same as Green New Deal. This is our, the money and the debt, and the corporations are using, really very firmly, massively lobbying to get those new resources as a the solution providers. So that's why in the national level, European level, it's so important to change fundamentally the approach to especially come to the healthcare, public health system, and the environmental issues, climate crisis. So we need to have public publicly funded and the public system to create massive scale of solutions. So this is, of course, the very, very vulnerable area of the corporation can take huge advantage. That's we don't have time to do the same mistakes the next 10 years.
Yeah. Before we wind up, we're going to wind up in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to ask you all, what do you think? Give me one next step that we should take on all of this. But before I do that, Max, you want to make a point?
Yeah, just picking up on something Pascal was saying earlier about restrictions on public bus ownership, and I think it connects to something Dave said as well, is that when we were doing work on outsourcing, what was interesting is that the whole legal playing field has been tilted towards privatization on top of all the rhetoric. Yeah, so we see this, we saw it with compulsory competitive tendering, but also in other aspects of local government law. And then we see it around buses, we see it in the NHS. And that means that in some ways the campaign is so much harder, but there's also a positive point there, which is the fact that even with those legal roadblocks to public ownership, that public ownership is still so popular, that we still had so much success in these campaigns, I think should give us a lot of hope for building towards the future.
Yeah. The next area which we want to be much more talk about is the work that Michelle Moore and John Christensen and Nick Shatson are doing around competition policy. They're looking at a global campaign around corporate capture of governments around competition, because that's the way in to actually control the whole range of government, not just privatization, but tax policies, the freedoms to exploit workers and all the rest. And I think we'll be doing a session on that at some stage, but I think that's another area for discussion that links a lot of these individual issues. I'm going to ask you all, just give us one step that you would take in this path towards winning the argument around public ownership and adoption of those policies. Dave, what do you think?
Well, I think from where I'm sitting, John, it's got to be trade unions mobilising behind a set of shared demands, totally to a lot of what all of the speakers said today, and being open to mobilise our members behind that. And I'm quite confident that if we really get out of worrying about, internal fights within the Labour Party and whatnot, and focus on what our demands are, I think certain things have cut through. As long as you build on the things that have cut through, key workers and their value has cut through. Free school meals has cut through. Government spending money to line the pockets of private companies is cutting through. People want that government spending to be used on what Max was saying, missions for the future that are going to benefit the whole of society. So you can connect all of these things, but I think it's about trade unions being, in part, a strong part, the arm of the call for action. That's what I would do. My job is to focus on that element of it. Trade unions together and working with organisations like We Own It. There's some fantastic models of collectivism that have grown out of this pandemic. And I think our job is to connect those. And then the policies is your job. And you guys, you're coming up with the policies. Our job is to mobilise behind it. And that's what we're going to focus on.
Just on you've been doing a lot of work around coordinating trade unions, but also to do that to influence the TUC now. How coherent do you think that work is now, particularly with regard to the TUC?
Well, the policies are all there. The policies have been agreed by the TUC. I was speaking to Francis the other week about the need to now turn it into serious mobilisation. So, we're going to, I chair a group that's called the New Deal Group. So we're going to write a paper, which I'm going to share with Francis and the group. And then hopefully we'll put it to the General Council, and that will be the start of agreeing what the shared demands are, and which all unions can get behind. And the secret here is to link it to the industrial issues, to the crisis that we're facing at the moment. And I think you can do that. It just needs a very clear and a bit of confidence that people will get behind us. And I'm feeling that. I'm feeling people out there they're not going to fall for something. They know what's led us into this. What they're not sure about at the moment is you know, having collectivism that drives a change forward. Well, that's our job, to give them that confidence, and I think we're going to do that.
I think that's reflected in the growth in union membership as well. You mentioned the NEU, tens of thousands of new members. We've had dispute after dispute in my constituency at Heathrow, Unite, and all the rest of it. PCS the same, recruiting like mad. You know, so it's interesting in the time of crisis like this that people are looking for the institutions that they've relied upon in the past, and the trade unions are part of that. That gives us a huge opportunity. Max, the first step, give us a step.
I think it's fighting for a publicly owned recovery, which means like telling the right story about what's happened with COVID so far. And that story is the countries that have dealt with it effectively internationally, that's South Korea or New Zealand, have had an active coordinated state. The countries that have failed have had fragmented privatization and outsourcing. Where things have gone right in the UK, for example, with the vaccine rollout, it's been public services driven. Join a trade union, support We Own It, read TNI reports.
I think that was 4 steps, but I'll give you that one, Max.
Sorry.
Satoko.
Yes, this is a real serious opportunity we are in. The public health, among others, this is really everybody's issue, everyday's issue. But if we can make narrative which reaches to individual hearts, for instance, public health care harms your health. This kind like something that people can feel. This is about ourselves, our life. So that's why we needed to have an integrated public health system to build. So that's something that I want to work with you guys, in the future, continuously working to really kind of capture this historic opportunity.
I think I agree. That's the way forward. Actually, what you've done today has been really helpful, just to demonstrate to people the databases as well, the Glasgow database in particular you worked on, because what we've lacked sometimes is be able to point to people and say, actually, if you are interested in campaigning about what's happening in your local hospital or whatever, here's some examples where there's been successes elsewhere. Water is a very good example where there has been water recovery, if you like, to whatever. So I think the work you're doing is invaluable. Thanks for that. Pascal. Next step.
I'd say it would be bringing together broad coalitions to fight for an NHS in public hands, a positive vision for that recovery, and resisting any handover to private companies.
Fully agree. Absolutely. Look, I want to thank you all for contributing. Okay, this has been really fascinating. It's been really helpful and informative as well. I hope everyone who was watching this as well will record this, and it'll go up on the website as well, so people can watch it and then participate. What I'm asking people to do as well is, if you go to the website, you'll be able to see this eventually. We'll put it up, but also have a look at the policy papers. A couple of things I'd like people to do is, one, first of all, give us comments on the policy papers so far. What you think about them, what gaps there are, what other ideas you've got. But then also, if you can suggest to us too about how we use this platform, and it's just one of many platforms really, to widen the discussion as we can around the different issues as they come up. I think I'm like Dave, I know it's the old Gramsci thing of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, but I'm actually quite optimistic of the intellect as well at the moment, because I'm looking out there, there's so many people campaigning. We're having success after success, both in terms of industrial successes in negotiations. Look at Barnoldswick and Rolls-Royce and saving jobs there. We're pushing back some of this issues around fire and rehire as well. But also people are campaigning on the ground and they're developing their ideas. I use the example of the Renters Union in Acorn, where they're now thinking of changing the whole concept of landlordism. And I think that's happening across a whole range of areas. And it's just a matter sometimes of making sure people know what's going on. Because when they do and they see all this activity, actually it does give people confidence. You don't read about it in the mainstream media. That's why we've got to use vehicles like this to get that message out. Anyway, I'd like to thank all the participants and thank all those people who've also contributed in the chat and listened to this discussion. Thanks a lot. Solidarity.
Cheers.
We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us, and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.